All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for attending our webinar today. We have mentor Stephen Bao with us. He's going to be talking to us today about designing for resilience. Just really quick, some logistical things. So the webinar itself is going to last about an hour, and the presentation itself is going to be anywhere from about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have the remaining time for Q&A. On the right side of your screen, or some part of your screen, there should be options that say chat, questions, polls, and people. The chat portion, it's just a chat. Go ahead and say hi, introduce yourself, let us know if you're in the program, where you're from. And then if you have any questions related to the presentation itself, we're going to want to post that in the questions tab, only so I can keep tabs on it and just kind of see, how you guys, like what questions you guys are asking. If there are certain questions that others have asked that you would like to see the answer to, please upvote them in that questions tab so I kind of know to make that a priority. But yeah, so I'm going to hand this over to Stephen, and he's going to screen share, and I'll let him take it from here.
All right. So that's probably one of the things that we didn't go over was screen sharing.
So at the bottom of your screen, there should be a few icons at the bottom. There's the mute, the microphone, the disable webcam.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
There should be an enable screen sharing.
Awesome. Great. Okay, here we go. Oh no, you must authorize screen sharing. This is awesome.
All right. Am I screen sharing that presentation that you shared with me?
Yeah.
The deck from earlier? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me grab that link and I will screen share for you. We are good, guys. We love technology. It is okay.
So meanwhile, maybe I should do a little bit of an intro.
Yeah, let's do that. And then I think I shared the screen, the slides.
Okay, great. Awesome.
Can you see it on your screen?
Just trying to switch here. Huh. Not seeing it.
All right. Everyone, I'm going to share the link to the presentation in the chat box, so feel free to follow along. And Stephen, we're just going to roll with it. We're going to go with it.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So here is the link to the presentation. Just shared it in that chat tab. And hopefully everyone can open that link. It should be available for just public viewing. Got it? Perfect. Thanks, guys. All right. Stephen, take it away.
Right. Awesome. Okay. So design for resilience. So we're in this kind of interesting time where this has become really, really relevant. And so what I'm going to do is just go to the third slide. The second slide is a little comp of a magazine that I put together. So it's just an idea at this point, but it's an idea about how we can make more of a community around design as a way to just think about where is design actually evolving to, and how do we adapt to the changing world that we're in right now. So in slide 3, I'm just going over what I'm going to be covering today. So what is resilience? 2, what is the role of the designer? 3, how can we gain permission to ask better questions or to think about the bigger picture? 4, how can we better understand the stories we tell ourselves and perhaps tell better stories? And then 5, how do we prototype for resilience? And to extend that, how do we then imagine, design, and build the future together? So Design for resilience, I think it starts by telling better stories. And so humans are unique in their ability to tell stories. And from my point of view, designers are really visual storytellers. What we're doing in Designlab, for example, is we're building case studies for UX design portfolios, and it's all about good storytelling. And one of the resources that I share with my designers all the time is this case study factory. So it's a really interesting article. It's kind of foundational to everything that we're trying to do. What I love about this document is that it's really well researched, and it gets to the heart of how you tell a good story as a UX designer as you're building your case studies. So moving on, maybe I should just tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Stephen Bao. I'm a professional designer, and I've been working since 1988. I'm a member of the Graphic Designers of Canada, and I've been a member since 1994. I've been mentoring with Designlab since about July 2018. Just on Friday, I was named Web Communications Chair of the Graphic Designers of Canada, or at least I accepted the position. I'm going to be meeting about that tomorrow. I've been working as a graphic designer. That's how I was trained about 30 years ago. But over the years, you just adapt to change. And so I've been a web designer, a front-end developer, a design educator, and you could say I'm working on becoming a full stack developer, but I'm basically run the full stack for some of my small clients in nonprofit organizations and the local work that I do here in Vancouver, Canada. So I'm also a founder and director of the Builders Collective. And so Builders is spelled with no vowels. And I turned it into this acronym. And it's about building leaders to design a resilient society. So I'm trying to build an organization that's about building resilience and relationships and community. And we're exploring how we can imagine, design, and build the future together. So what you'll see as we're going through this presentation is a little bit about how I've been building my brand over the last little while. So I formed the corporation in 2015, thinking, oh, maybe I'll work with some local design graduates from the university that I was teaching at. What happened was the kind of work that I wanted to do just wasn't really happening the way I was expecting. So I kind of needed to do a little pivot. But that's how we come to kind of the story of resilience in my own career over 30 years. You just have to keep on adapting to whatever changes come along. So I've given you a slide that shows what I've been working on lately as the Builders Collective. So it's just independent publishing at the moment, working on my own, but also in connection with some friends or some colleagues who are resonating with this idea. So one in particular has said, why don't we run a podcast? Because this idea of resilience just keeps on coming up. So I just started building a collection of sites based on some websites that I've just website domain names that I've registered over the years, and they've just been areas where I just prototype. So a lot of what I do is rather than prototyping in a UX design tool, I do my prototyping in code, because that's just kind of what I've been doing over the years as a front-end developer is building rapid interactive prototypes as HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'm at the point where, well, I could spend some time in a UX design tool, but to me, that's always felt like a little bit of wasted effort when I can just go straight into the tools that I use every day to actually build things. So here's where we get into the story about resilience, and it goes back to a little bit of my obsession about the history of graphic design. But I'm just going to start off with the idea of the crisis that we're in. So we're on slide 14, if anyone's following. This is just a stock photo from Adobe stock. So they're trying to picture the coronavirus, but obviously that's not what it looks like. But here we are talking about resilience in a time of a global pandemic, a financial crisis, and the big question is, how do we adapt to a new reality? And the interesting thing is we can look back 100 years and realize, well, the world was really back in dealing with that same idea of, maybe they weren't talking specifically about resilience, but they were in a global crisis. There was the Great War had just ended in an armistice. A global pandemic, the Spanish flu, had just devastated the world. And there was a looming financial crisis. So the same question would have arisen at the same time. How do we adapt to this new reality? So when I was teaching at the university, we were using a text called Graphic Design, The New Basics. And I was surprised to come across this text and discover that the new basics was actually looking back at the legacy of the Bauhaus. So if you don't know about the Bauhaus, it's a design school that was started in Germany in the Weimar Republic and in April of 1919. So just after the World War I had ended. So what they had to deal with at the time was this major collapse of everything that the world had understood as daily life had devolved into this war that spread around the world, and then people were dying all over the place because of the Spanish flu. So here we are in 2020 trying to think, well, we've kind of been through this before, and is there anything that we can learn from the past? And we're looking back into the history books about, okay, what do you do when you have this worldwide pandemic? What do they do during the Spanish flu? And a lot of times you just have to stop and start thinking, well, how do we get back to basics? And that's basically, what the Bauhaus was trying to do was, okay, we don't have a monarchy anymore. It's been abolished. We're experimenting with a new form of government, democracy in the Weimar Republic. So the same sort of thing was happening in art, where it was a matter of coming back to, well, why do we need all these really decorative buildings that look like ancient temples from Athens? Why don't we try something completely new? Maybe asymmetrical design. So they're starting with the really basic ideas of geometry. So it was all about basic colors, maybe reduce everything to black, white, and gray, and to primary colors, blue, yellow, and red. You have basic shapes like circle, triangle, and square, but then in the three-dimensional space, spheres, cones, and cubes. And then once you get into industrial or architectural materials, then you're thinking about steel, glass, and concrete. And this became kind of the international architectural style that when people started learning about the Bauhaus, they were amazed by what they were trying to do there. So they were basically starting from the ground up, and in 1919, in April 1919, Walter Gropius released this Bauhaus manifesto that talked about how he was going to try to unite all of the arts into one institution. So it was dealing with the same sort of things that we're dealing with now, this division between the elites and just the working class people. So the elite academic fine artists and architects were being combined with the working class craftspeople who made the objects of everyday life. But over time, Weimar became hostile to the liberal influence of the Bauhaus. Walter Gropius designed the building of the future, a model of the modern educational environment. And then it was meant to combine the functions of daily life into a synergistic whole. So they moved to Dessau in 1925, and the new building was inaugurated in late 1926. So it was all, the building was a model of asymmetrical geometry. It was a really daring architectural style that few or no one really had ever seen this style of modern architecture before. There were curtain walls of glass that were cantilevered to float in front of the structural supports. And it combined the functions of daily life into this synergistic whole where there were workshops, there was administration area, which was like a bridge over top of a road that went underneath the building. And then there were areas where there was a theater, a canteen, a cafeteria, and the living quarters for the students. So it was all built into one living space where all of life was revolving. And in fact, if you take a downward look at the building, you have this kind of spiral effect as you see these masses of architectural shapes being spun around the center of the building. So it was using these industrial materials, steel, glass, and concrete. and now we see that everywhere, right? The modern world took that prototype and basically grew it larger to increase density, and we see our cities are just almost imitations of what Walter Gropius had created as his initial prototype at that time. So there's I'm probably going to have to skim pretty quickly over the next bits of my materials. But here we get to the idea of, what is resilience? So the next slides that I have are just images of the brand that I've been creating to be able to communicate this idea of what is a builder's collective. And I'll get to where that idea comes from pretty soon. Mainly what I'm trying to do with this idea, or the beginnings of maybe an organization, is thinking back to what the Bauhaus was trying to do, and how did they create an environment that was able to be resilient, to be able to bounce back from all the challenges that they were facing. So I'm going to start with, what is resilience? And I think a good way to understand the term is often to think of its opposite, So the opposite of resilient might be brittle or fragile. Now, a rubber ball will bounce back, but a dry twig will snap. So in just a phrase, resilience is strength in the face of adversity. And there's a book by Judith Rodin, who she wrote a book called The Resilience Dividend, the subtitle being strong in a world where things go wrong. So she describes as resilience as the capacity of any entity, an individual, a community, an organization, or a natural system to prepare for disruptions, to recover from shocks and stresses, and to adapt and grow from a disruptive experience. So as you build resilience, you become more able to prevent or mitigate stresses and shocks you can identify, and better able to respond to those you can't predict or avoid. You also develop greater capacity to bounce back from a crisis, learn from it, and achieve revitalization. Ideally, as you become more adept at managing disruption and skilled at resilience building, you're able to create and take advantage of new opportunities in good times and bad. That is the resilience dividend. So she goes on to say, in the 21st century, building resilience is one of our most urgent social and economic issues because we live in a world that is defined by disruption. Not a month goes by that we don't see some kind of disturbance to the normal flow of life somewhere. A cyber attack, a new strain of virus, a structural failure, a violent storm, a civil disturbance, an economic blow, a natural system threatened. So it's interesting, she wrote this book, or published it in 2014, and it's almost prescient as you listen to what she's talking about, that all these things that she's talking about are actually happening almost all at once in this one global pandemic that we're in right now. So in terms of design, though, a lot of what we do as designers is we're taking a look at problems that we're seeing in the world and trying to fix what we see as wrong. And that, as UX designers, is where we find our opportunities. We're doing our research and interviewing people, building personas around, well, where are their pain points? Where are their frustrations? And where are the problems that they're facing in the way they're using certain products? And you might have heard of the Norman doors. Don Norman, made famous by critiquing the way sometimes you encounter a door handle and there can be some ambiguity about which way the door opens and whether you're supposed to push or pull. And this might be the first introduction to how you can integrate design thinking into the way you're observing the world, is just noticing those problems when you encounter them. So I think in Designlab, we're helping people to learn the philosophy, the empathy, the tools, and the skills to better understand how to create products that solve these human problems. And we uncover these latent business opportunities to improve products by observing when things go wrong. So just like in life, it's through failure that we learn what works. And we learn to walk by crawling, and then toddling, falling, and getting back up again. So we discover balance by working against the natural forces of gravity, by using our sixth sense of equilibrium to avoid the pain of falling. And you might have thought we only had 5 senses, but actually the ear contains the sensory apparatus for both hearing and balance. And without a working vestibular system, we can't stand upright. So one of the things that we see in our world right now is this imbalance. People are either running to the left or to the right. And probably neither of those camps actually really gets a full understanding of reality. And so we actually need to balance our understanding of reality by making sure that we're listening to everybody, that we're not in these filter bubbles. But because we have a kind of political system that is designed for this kind of polarization, we're losing our balance just because of the way the media environment is kind of built. And here's where I want to get to the role of the designer. A lot of the things that are causing the problems right now have actually been built by designers. And in some ways, it's not all the designer's fault. I would say my definition of design goes a little bit broader. It actually goes to, we're all involved in building technologies and designing tools. In that way, we're all designers. And I think that's where Designlab is great in being able to democratize access to tools. So now, anybody around the world can learn UX design if they have access to the computer and the tools to be able to do this sort of work. So all of these abilities that we have as humans are actually just extensions of our usual abilities. The tools, like a hammer, is just an extension of the hand and the arm, and it has the ability to enhance our innate abilities that we wouldn't have otherwise if we weren't using those tools. So it gives us more strength when we're pounding a nail into a piece of wood. You wouldn't want to do that with your hand. But it also has the effect of not only enhancing, but also numbing our ability or our innate abilities. So you can't actually sense anything through that hammer. Your hand is kind of numbed to what you're actually doing until maybe your thumb gets in the way. So then you find out, okay, well, that was a lot of force in the wrong direction. And so the wheel is kind of the same thing. It's enhancing our ability in mobility. So we would usually walk, but once you introduce the wheel, we can increase our speed. And in the same way, we're looking at the way we're designing tools now, not only to enhance our business operations through using computers to enhance our brains and our ability to remember things. So we're actually outsourcing our memories to Google, for instance. Why do we need to memorize something when we go to school? It's more about how do we learn to be creative in a really fast changing technological environment. But what Google is doing to our brains is actually, because it's relieving us of this cognitive load of having to remember everything, we're actually not making the effort of remembering things. And if Google was to go away and we couldn't find a search bar, how much could we actually retrieve from our memories about everything that we're learning? We've become so dependent on it. So what we're discovering is, resilience is finding that balance between our innate abilities as human beings, and then how much do we give away to maybe the computers that are sort of helping us with our lives, but also these large corporations who are taking more and more of a share in the way our lives are run as a species. And we've gotten to the point where we're thinking about this human project that we're all involved in, and it seems like, well, it's this big picture, this big story that we're all involved in. And here's where we're getting into kind of the idea of modernism and postmodernism. So modernism kind of started with what the Bauhaus was doing. They were kind of the original progenitors of this idea. They didn't invent modernism, but they were the ones who I would say were primary in disseminating this idea around the world that there's a way of combining art and technology, and then with business in a way that we can scale up all our abilities and capabilities to the size of a city or a nation state. And now we have these huge industrially driven societies and cities that depend on a very finely balanced system of logistics and advertising and economics. And that system just didn't arise out of nowhere. It was designed. And we designed it over the last 100 years. The world has not seen anything like this previous to it, but the design that we've created has come with some consequences. And one of those consequences is the ability to fly around the world carrying a virus that can infect the world in just a matter of a few days if you have the sort of interactions that are happening on this sort of global scale. So when we also combine that with a set of other conditions such as global warming, climate change, and the pollution that's coming from our dependency on the reserves of fossil fuels that we're digging out of the ground, what we end up with is some unintended consequences. And this is where resilience comes into play. Resilience is about knowing when things are going wrong and being able to respond appropriately to those situations. And I think here's where Designlab is poised to be a solution to the problems that are going on in the world right now. We're helping designers learn these tools of empathy and research and prototyping to be able to solve problems at a fairly large scale. So we've been mainly thinking about screens and focusing on digital products and how we build large design systems. But I think we're getting to the point, and Jesse James Garrett, he runs some presentations called Design for Engagement, where he's talking about what are we actually designing for when we talk about designing for human experience. You know, we call ourselves user experience designers, and I've seen people who actually take issue with the idea of, well, should we actually be calling people users? Because that's a little dehumanizing. Can we just call people humans? And so I tend to think of what we're doing more as, yeah, we can't actually design people's experiences. We can't get into their brains and actually, tell them how to feel, but we can create products that evoke certain emotions when they use them. So what we're involved in is usability testing. But we're at a point where we're no longer actually building just products. We are actually building social systems. And if we realize the power that we have right now, we should actually be shifting our toolkit to better understand, well, how do we understand human behavior? Do we really understand what we're designing for? What is human experience? And so what I've done is, at the end of last year, I was just trying to play around with, well, personas get us so far, in trying to understand and have empathy for our users. But they don't give us a really good picture of the stories that people are telling themselves that have a huge impact on their perceptions, their values, and their behaviors. So how do we really understand how that all works? And so what I did was I tried to create what I'm calling a new design deliverable. They're mental models for human experience. And what I was trying to do with these models was, so if you want to understand what I'm looking at, you can, I'll share some of these resources with you later, but there's a whole article that I've been working on. I'm just going to share it in the chat here. So here's the text of the talk, and that's way longer. It was going to turn out to be an hour long if I was going to go through this whole presentation. But there's some some diagrams that I've built that are giving you a sense of how complex human beings are as a system. So as designers, we're building systems or designing for systems. And what we're working with as our raw materials are human beings, and human experience is actually this really complex web of many nested systems. So at the core of who we are, we understand that there's time, energy, and matter. And so I've broken all of these things down into triads to try to understand, relating it somehow to the Bauhaus, because everything was about three elements making a unified whole. Just like the color systems, the additive and subtractive color systems, cyan and magenta and yellow. Yeah, the black, because the black isn't dark enough in printing, but essentially it's really just three colors. And then RGB that we use for our screens. So anyway, I built this idea of taking Jesse James Garrett idea of, we have this idea of our experience comes from our perceptions, and we process that through our cognition, but also through our emotions. So we have these two ways of sense making that are kind of fighting against each other, but out of that comes our behaviors, our actions. So we have perception, cognition, emotion, and action, and they correlate to our mind, heart, and body, and our six senses. And so from that core, we have certain values that are built out of stories. Everything that we understand in life is just memories of stories, and then we build stories of stories to kind of understand our place in reality. And what we get out of this model is, from the core reality, we have natural products that will come out of that, depending on what your orientation is. And so to me, designers are about imagination, design, and building solutions. But we actually live in a world that's quite different. We live in a world that's built in the form of nation states and corporations. And where do they come from? They come from these old models that we can trace back our history, in North America, for example, as 500 years ago, roughly, some people learned how to get into boats and cross oceans and discover resources that they could extract from other lands. And so the mode that they were in at the time was, how many resources can we get to enrich the countries? And we're competing with other European countries to get as many resources as possible. And this same game has been going on for quite a while. Corporations are just really an extension of the old game of the monarchies. And we're at a stage in our cultural evolution, I believe, that we're recognizing there's something wrong with this model. And we really have to change the way we're thinking about our social systems. Are they based on this idea of scientific social Darwinism, where we're just fighting over scraps and scarce resources, competing with other species or other members of our own species to just survive? Or did we evolve through collaboration? And actually, what makes us human beings is our ability to work together and to solve problems and create tools that actually help each other out. And I think what we're finding out in the midst of this pandemic is that resilience actually does come from a way more synergistic way of looking at how do we all work together to figure this out and make sure that we survive this crisis. So I'm going to leave it there. I might not have covered everything that I planned to, but I want to leave room for some Q&A. So I hope that is a good summation. Maybe what I can do is just leave off with what I'm trying to do is build a community, and this is just my first kind of foray into testing an idea. So this is my prototype of, well, if we're building social systems, what kind of social system would I build? And this is kind of.
That was awesome. Thanks so much, Stephen. I learned so much, even just like listening. It was probably better for me to just listen to what you were saying. So I loved it. So I'm going to go through some Q&A. We have total of 4 questions. 2 of them are burning questions, tons of upvotes. And then the other ones are a little bit more specific towards tools. So the question that got the most votes was from Joanne. And she's asking, as a designer, what lesson from design history do you think is important to keep in mind in our day-to-day work in the digital age?
Wow. I think Marshall McLuhan gives us a lot of insights into how to think about media. So in a way, he's using, there's this book actually that he wrote in 1964 called Understanding Media. And he's calling the media extensions of man. Okay, so he wasn't an involved male. He was still talking in gender terms because that was the time. So they're extensions of human capabilities. These are tools that we're using to extend our abilities into areas that we didn't think were actually possible. But we have to be aware of what the trade-offs are. If we're going to give our abilities to a technology, then you might say, as soon as we connected to a network, privacy went away. As soon as you can send information around the world in seconds, then who can protect their privacy? So we have to understand that with every technology that we introduce into the world, there's going to be a trade-off. And we can look back on 100 years of using the internal combustion engine and realize, well, if we had to do it again, we probably wouldn't. We would probably realize, okay, we had the technology to run electric vehicles years and years ago, and it was killed by an industry that discovered, well, we can make a ton of money by extracting all these resources out of the ground and then selling it at a premium. So why don't we control, the market and who has access to certain tools. So if you get rid of the electric vehicle, you create demand for the kind of products that you want to put out into the world. We have to think about the unintended consequences of what we're doing is ultimately the takeaway from that.
There's always a trade-off, right? Like we kind of feel like that's part of why there's still resistance to technology. It's because we know what we know. Whatever tools we're familiar with are already extensions of us. We already figured out how to do it. And now you're telling us that we have to move away from it and do something else. So it's a little scary.
Exactly. Yep. Once you create habits, and I think that's the other thing that we need to be aware of is once you create infrastructure, especially physical infrastructure that involves roads, suburbia, downtown city centers, and now your work depends on buying that vehicle so you can have the means to get between your home and your work. You've built into your system some hardwired, almost like hardwiring your brain, to do one thing. How are you going to change your habits when that thing is something you have to pick apart and then start building something else before you can create a new system?
Yep, definitely. Oh man, I feel like these are some loaded questions. But great topic. Okay, next one. We often wear so many different hats as a designer with so many roles. How do you introduce yourself in one title or word, or almost like elevator pitch yourself?
Wow. Yeah, so this is something that I've been trying to figure out. Well, what do I call myself? And my title has changed a fair number of times over the years. So what I sort of landed on was I used to do something called information architecture, and then I'm sure that's what we're learning in Designlab. But we don't call ourselves that anymore. We don't call ourselves information architects. We've graduated to user experience designer, and now we're thinking, well, let's maybe take the word user out of that because it might be dehumanizing. And if we're thinking about where is design evolving to, I think we're building social architecture. And the way I would want to call myself then is a social architect, because really that is what we're building. Even if it's, if you're building Airbnb, what are you building there? That's a huge social system. It's not only the staff who are building it, but also the connections that you're building between the people who are supplying a place to live or to stay for a moment in time, or building networks of reputation that go along with are you going to be someone you want to have in your home? So these are really complex social systems, and I think what we've forgotten to do was design our governments. We've just decided, well, we get that for free. We don't have to think about that anymore. But now that we're watching how they work, I think we're starting to realize, no, they're fundamentally broken, and they're built on ideas that were, at least 500 years old. And then they prototype something, and we're still experimenting with the idea and realizing, no, I think we can throw away that prototype and try something else. But it's not so easy because it's not a prototype. It's now our infrastructure. So, yeah.
Yep. And the longer we kind of stick to those things, the harder it is to be able to break away, just because, like you said, like there's going to be a lot of trade-offs, and there's going to be a lot of things that will present itself that we haven't thought of. It's going to be really interesting. The next one is actually really relevant to what we were just talking about. So question is, how do we ground and center ourselves to see the world as a designer? What does it actually mean to help people as a designer?
Wow. Yeah, that is a pretty loaded question. I think this is the perspective I've come to as a designer is we are supposed to be the dumbest people in the room. And the whole thing that we're trying to do is be empathetic and be curious and not get trapped in our own cognitive biases. So how do we do that? Well, we have to have this growth mindset or a curiosity mindset where let's just assume that I don't know anything about this and I need to find out who's the experts. And we need to be able to do our research. So as designers, I think mostly what we're doing these days is, I think what service designers are, getting into the habit of doing is facilitating. So I'm seeing this term a lot lately is, what do you do? Oh, I do facilitation. Well, what is that? Oh, well, I gather people so we can run a workshop and then we can, throw ideas around and try to figure out, well, how do we make sense of this? And once we make sense of this, we really don't know what's going to work until we prototype something. So what we're doing as designers is applying the scientific method to creativity. So we're taking what used to be done in a lab and actually doing it in real time on people, which gives us a lot of responsibility. So we have to be very, very careful in how we're going to structure our research. We're going to put together a hypothesis, figure out a prototype that kind of proves whether that's true or not. And then we do some usability testing to see whether that thing works. And then we put it out into the world. So I think it's understanding that responsibility of, we don't really call design a science, but that's kind of what the Bauhaus was trying to do. If you take a look at the diagrams of how they were structuring their pedagogy or their instructional program for architects, they split a human in half and then realized one side is rational intellect and one side is intuitive emotion. And then we smush that all together and try to figure out, well, how do we make it all work together? But I love that idea of thinking of us as more of a holistic unity, where it's not this fight against the rational and against the emotional. It's realizing we're both of those things. We're a limbic system, but we're also a rational mind. And we have to understand where those tensions are and find out, well, we kind of need our emotions to remain human, because that's where our empathy and our compassion and our love comes from. But we also need to use our analytical mind to understand, well, how do we make sense of quantum mechanics? It's kind of running everything, but we don't understand it. So we still need to put some thought to that. Anyway, I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Well, there's a lot more that are actually relevant to what you're just talking about. So the next one is, how do designers become more mindful about whether design will have a negative impact in the future or if it will hurt a certain group?
Excellent question. This gets to the core of what resilience means. And I think we always have to have our antenna up as to, I could build this thing, but maybe the question is, why should I build it? And I think if we're rushing headlong into this idea of we need artificial intelligence, it's going to drive our vehicles, it's going to clean our floors, relieve us of some duties right now that humans can't do because, they're going to spread disease. But I think we have to fundamentally think about, well, I'm sort of losing my train of thought there, but ask me the question again, just so I'm just getting back there.
Let's see. Oh, how do designers become more mindful about whether design will have a negative impact in the future or if it will hurt a certain group?
Right. So in public relations, a big part of your job is actually knowing what the threats are going to be. What kind of messages are we going to come up against? And you actually have to have an action plan for, if such and such happens, then we use plan A. If such and such happens, we use plan B. We actually have to have a whole bunch of different plans for what are we going to do when something goes a little awry. At this point, we have some pretty good ideas of what's going wrong. We have a whole bunch of scientists, 97% of them being pretty sure that we're doing something wrong with our ecosystems. So they have some plans in place for, what can we do? Something called the Drawdown Project is a list of what are the main things that we can be paying attention to. So mainly we have to be listening to who are the experts on what could go wrong. And if the scientists are saying, well, these things are already going wrong, we knew about it 60 years ago, but we did nothing about it, that might be something that we could attend to right now.
Definitely. All right. We have time for one more question before we are done. We have a lot of great questions, but a lot of them are loaded as well. So if I may just take some time to collect some of these later. And if Stephen would like to spend some time answering them, he can later. If not, if you guys are a part of the Designlab community, feel free to post it in whatever channels we have and we can see if we can get answers. But the last one, let's go over. All right, this one was actually pretty highly upvoted. So how do you see design systems evolving? More specifically, how does an agile mindset apply to design and production workflows?
So agile methodology is something that we were using in our web agency. And it's all about efficiency, really. So we're taking that industrial mode of, how do we apply the industrial mode of production to the process of creativity. And having a daily check-in is a way of making sure that things don't go off the rails really quickly. So I think a lot of what we're doing right now is trying to build systems that that can be resilient by having a whole bunch of people working on the same thing at the same time. So we can learn a lot from open source, where that agile methodology comes from. We can build really complex things if each of us is a specialist in one particular area. But we also need to have people who are also thinking about the bigger picture. So if we get into a place where we have, I remember, I can't remember what the story was. I read a magazine, Omni magazine back in the 80s, about Isaac Asimov, and he wrote a science fiction story about how the people of the world built this gigantic machine. And because they had experts who were able to know how to build and maintain the system, everything was fine for the first little while. But once those people died off and everyone became specialists, then there was no one who really knew what was going on. So I think you need to have both people who understand, the bigger picture, but also those who are in the details and figuring things out. If you don't have that balance, things can go off the rails really quickly. And I think that's where we're at as a human species. We're so mired in the details that we're not looking at the big picture.
Yep, and I think a common term that a lot of you may hear thrown around is what, what kind of designer are you? Are you, on that T-shaped, what kind of T-shaped designer are you? So there's that, the generalist, but then you have the specialist. So kind of all relates to that. But anyways, this is all we have time for. We are at the end of the webinar. Thank you, Stephen, so much. This was, I'm sure, so beneficial for everyone here. It's a very different topic talking about design, but I'm sure helpful nonetheless, for sure. Thank you everyone for attending. My name is Emily. I did not introduce myself in the beginning. I am the Designlab student and community advocate. And I'm sure you guys have seen me around, post a bunch of things, but thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you, Stephen, again, for your time as well, putting all this together. It's awesome. I will share out the link to the webinar and as well as a bunch of the resources that Stephen shared, and I'm gonna try to collect the resources that everyone else has shared in here. But yeah, if you guys have any feedback, any questions, feel free to ping me on Slack or send Designlab an email. All right.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.